when we are when we're pressuring kids in that way, what we are teaching them is actually that our love is conditional. I don't think that we see, parents might see it that way, but what that teaches children is that you get rewarded and you get my affection when you perform, and I pull it away from you when you don't perform in this way that makes me look good. And what we're teaching kids when we do that is that their self-worth comes from their performance. And when those kids become adults, they don't have the ability to understand that they have worth and they matter just for who they are.
Welcome to PedsDocTalk TV and this episode of the PedsDocTalk Podcast, where you can catch my amazing conversations with guests on the show here on my YouTube channel, or if you prefer audio only, wherever you access podcasts. I'm Dr. Mona Amin, a board-certified pediatrician, lactation consultant, and mom of two, and I'm here to uplift, support, and guide you so you can raise those incredible kids. Let's get to today's amazing conversation. I'm really excited about today's guest. Her name is Prachi Gupta. She is an award-winning journalist and former senior reporter at Jezebel. She won a Writers Guild Award for her investigative essay, Stories About My Brother. They Called Us Exceptional is her debut memoir and was named one of the top 40 books of 2023 by Amazon, one of the best 18 memoirs of the year by Audible, and was nominated for a Goodreads Choice Award. Her work was featured in the Best American Magazine Writing 2021 and has appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post Magazine, Marie Claire, Salon, Elle, and elsewhere. She lives in New York City, and we are chatting today about her book, but also about how the model minority myth has caused us more harm than good. Thank you so much for joining me today, Prachi.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I relate to this topic already so much. I have to say, you were highly requested by someone really important in my life, which was my husband. He is a model minority child as well, Indian American. He read your book, They Called Us Exceptional and Other Lives That Raised Us, in about 2 days because he binge read it because it was that good. And he's like, you need to have her on the show. And it's on my list to read next. Thank you so much. Tell us more about yourself and what inspired you to write this book.
Yeah, so I'm a journalist, but I never wanted to write about myself. I like reporting. I like writing about other people.
Yeah.
But in 2017, my brother Yash died at the age of 29. And I'm not really going to go into like the details of his death or what happened, but I will say that we had been estranged for about 2 years at the time. So, in addition to dealing with the shock of his death, I was also trying to piece together who he had become in the time that we'd been estranged and how he died, how this happened, and really what I, as his sister, could have done to prevent this outcome, to have saved him or you know, have intervened, and why that intervention was really felt impossible, and like how far back we had had to go in order to change things from going down this path. And that sent me down this investigation where I that resulted in the essay that you mentioned, Stories About My Brother. And this essay was an exploration into masculinity and mental health and the intersection of race and gender and those issues, the way that being a brown man, and specifically an Indian American man in America, had he dealt with all of these pressures, these psychological pressures, these social pressures to conform to certain expectations, and he was struggling with it largely alone. And as his sister, I didn't really see or understand that until after he died. And that also was what created a wedge in our relationship, because I was struggling with my own set of pressures as an Indian American woman. And we weren't able to have a dialogue about those things with each other. And that is really what created the rift between us that led to our estrangement, where I had started to identify as a feminist and he had started to identify with men's rights views. And so that exploration, Stories About My Brother, I was really afraid to publish this essay, but in doing so, I mean, I was overwhelmed by the response. I heard from moms around the country who said, so immigrant moms who said they had no idea that their kids could be struggling with their mental health, and they
Yeah.
were going to now start talking about mental health in their households. I heard from men who said, I've never been able to admit this, but I think that I'm living with depression, and your essay has convinced me to seek help. I heard from siblings, a lot of sisters who said, I've seen this change in my brother and I don't understand who he is anymore. And your essay helped me understand him better and and how to talk to him, and gave me compassion for what he might be going through. So when I realized that, I thought that my family was the only one. And when I heard these responses, I realized that there were families all across the country and the world dealing with these issues, thinking that they were alone too. And that's when I knew that I had to write my full story and tell everything, go into my full story in the form of a memoir, even though I didn't really want to write about myself. But I realized that I had to, in order, because I knew this story was going to help so many people make sense of the chaos in their own lives.
Thank you so much. For anyone listening, I'm actually getting teary eyed. This is also going to go on YouTube as well, so you can see me getting emotional. But hearing how powerful you are as a writer, and I know you said that you were writing and then you pivoted to actually doing a memoir and getting more personal. I know how hard that must have been, but thank you, because like you just said, you have changed the lives of so many people who, I talk about mental health a lot on this podcast. Even though I do parenting, I strongly believe that we need to talk about parental mental health and the mental health of us as adults who may end up having children. Because if we don't take care of ourselves and understand the why behind why we might be feeling this way, we can't do anything for our children. And so for me, it's very powerful. I think storytelling is extremely powerful. Like you have just said, people around the world are approaching you saying how much this resonated with you. And I already mentioned my husband as well. Struggled with his own mental health and for so long didn't know how to get help. And finally he has, and it's changed his life, our children's life. And so first and foremost, thank you for that. Thank you for taking that pain, that we went through, that what happened. And, estrangement in itself is its own episode, an own story, we could talk about, and taking that story and really turning it into, I think what you're doing here is purpose to really impact so many people. And so thank you. I personally also am estranged from my sister at the time of this recording. And it's emotional when you say that, because I also think about what if something happens to her and I never got to talk to her about that. And that's really hard to hear. And I'm so sorry that you lost your brother. I'm sorry that the estrangement happened. Obviously there's so many things that could have led up to that we don't need to go into. But I get emotional talking about that because I feel that so deeply, and want, that feeling of what could I have done? What can we do to fix this relationship? Where did it go wrong? And then to not be able to have that closure with your brother. So thank you again for being so vulnerable and sharing that. I know we're talking about, obviously, more about this whole concept of the model minority. And a lot of my listeners may not know what that is. So what is the model minority and the traditional notion of success that has been weaved into this narrative? And why has this been harmful? For anyone who may not be familiar, I know, but a lot of my listeners may not know.
Sure. Yeah. So the model minority myth is a racial stereotype that originated in the 1960s, specifically with the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, Nationality Act of 1965. So before this act, Asians were largely barred from entry into the United States. This was actually also the case in Canada. And there was first an all out ban, and then there was quotas. So people, very few people were allowed. And that changed in the civil rights era in 1965 with this new immigration law. And what that allowed was suddenly an influx of people from Asia. And their entry into the United States was predicated upon their skill set, their education levels, their family ties. So it was really bringing in a very specific class of people, upwardly mobile. And when this large influx of Asians came into the country, the story that was woven around them was, oh, look at how successful they are. Like if you're Asian, you're innately hardworking, you're innately, good at science and math. And I think many of us, even if we're not familiar with the model minority stereotype terminology, are familiar with the stereotype itself, with these characteristics that are attributed to a lot of Asian Americans. And part of that was also like you have tight knit families, stable families, you're problem free, you don't complain. And there are a couple of things that are really harmful about this stereotype. One is that it was used at the time and continues to be used today to drive a wedge between other communities of color. So, it was really used to temper the civil rights movement and say, well, look, if these, quote unquote, Asians can be so successful to Black America, well, why can't you lift yourself up by the bootstraps? And it enabled this idea, this myth of America as a meritocracy, where anyone can achieve the American dream simply through hard work. And so it persists today. I mean, that's how affirmative action was gutted on the back of the model minority myth. So it has serious implications politically and socially, and it's used to uphold a power hierarchy in this country. And we have some more awareness about that now. I think in recent years, there's been more conversation about that. But one thing that we still don't really talk a lot about is the personal and social and mental impacts of this myth. So, I come from a family that we didn't have the terminology for model minority, but we felt the pressures of it every single day. And as my grandparents and parents came into this country, they're actually all immigrants. And so for them, it was a survival strategy. It was, you have to, where do you belong in this country? Oh, this is the only way I can belong. And this is the safest way, because if you don't adhere to these norms, then suddenly you risk alienation, isolation, being ostracized, violence. So it was really out of survival too that they, to assimilate. And so I grew up very much in the confines of this myth with these expectations of this is who I must be. But, when one of the things I explore in my book is that it has tremendous psychological impacts, because when we are forcing ourselves to conform to this idea of perfection, this abstract idea that can actually never fully be achieved, we're learning how to suppress everything that doesn't fit that. We're breaking ourselves to fit into a mold, and we orient ourselves towards external validation rather than our internal sense of peace. So we actually lose over time the ability to be vulnerable, to create intimacy with the people we love, to be connected to our authentic selves. We learn how to disconnect from ourselves, which is what causes or leads to so many mental health problems, because I view mental health as inherently a connection, an ability to be connected to yourself and the world around you. And so we live in a world that seeks to disconnect us from ourselves. And we're orienting ourselves towards that when we buy into the model minority myth. And so I wanted to write this book to help people see how these structures work, see how they affect us as individuals, and then maybe then that can motivate people to make changes in their lives and help really dismantle this myth that's so damaging, not just at a personal level, at a societal and structural and collective level as well.
Absolutely agree. I mean, you mentioned it perfectly. The external validation, the lack of being able to be vulnerable, lack of being authentic self. No wonder you mentioned that it can lead to mental health struggles, because you're basically fighting a constant battle between yourself, what you want and what you're being expected of. And so thank you so saying that so beautifully, because I don't think people understand that, when the history behind it, and when your parents are coming to this country with the expectation that performance is how you need to survive. And then as a child of that environment, like I know you can probably relate to this as myself, everything was performance based, right? The external validation, like you mentioned, how are you doing in grades? We joke about that. Like we joke about it so much about, oh yeah, I got an A- or I got a B+ and my parent whooped me. But we don't really truly get how that impacts a child. And as they grow up, how it impacts their selves and their mental health. And I felt it, my husband felt it. We both suffer from anxiety and depression because of this model minority myth, I will say, because we didn't have space to be vulnerable. We didn't have space to feel sad. It was always like you said, you got to be happy. You got to toe the company line. You can't step out of line. You got to be obedient. And I have a parenting podcast, and we know that obedience is not the goal, right? Children are going to test boundaries. They're going to have their opinions. But from a model minority standpoint, oh no, you can't speak up for what you believe in. You have to be problem free, like you mentioned. What other ways do you see this kind of showing up in maybe even personally, or what you've seen in terms of like shame and isolation? Like, have you seen that, that this kind of create this narrative of like feelings of shame and isolation for many people?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because what it does is when you learn to suppress, like when you're oriented towards external validation and performance, you adopt a set of ideas of like what's good is everything that helps you achieve or get to the next level, which are markers set not by you or people even necessarily that you care about. They're set by expectations in society that's really oriented towards labor, your
Yeah.
ability to be productive and produce capital in the world. So it's not about your well-being. It's not about, how kind you are. It's not about how you treat other people. It's about how much you can get. It's very transactional based. And so what that does is you learn how to hide everything else. And you become ashamed of those things because when you're hiding something, you're hiding it because you think it's bad, and it associates all of these negative feelings with things that are totally natural emotions. Like you mentioned, like our emotions exist for a reason. They are there to tell us something, and when we learn to suppress everything that's negative, one, we don't know how to deal with it. So when we feel an overwhelming emotion of sadness or anger or fear, instead of acknowledging it and learning how to process those emotions, we bury them and we feel shame with them, and then they erupt in ways that we don't understand, and then cause chaos in our lives, and then we get even tighter on the suppression, and then again the cycle continues and it explodes. And that's certainly what happened in my family, with all of us in various ways. So yeah, I mean, it breeds shame and isolation because the thing that creates connection is the ability to share our fears, our all of these scary bits of ourselves, and see that we're not alone in them, and see that other people go through the same exact things. And if we were able to talk about it in a way that's compassionate and non-judgmental, then we could feel connected instead of alone. But when you're so focused on suppressing that because you think that it's not allowed or it's not safe, you are sitting in isolation and shame and not realizing that you're actually not alone in this.
Yeah, absolutely. There's such an isolation in this feeling, and I love that you're on the show because I think so many people, whether they grew up in the model minority experience or not, that this sort of external validation raising, right? The end goal. What is it that you're doing for other people? And you said it perfectly. A lot of this is who creates these rules, right? It's society, but who decides what is success, right? I'm an entrepreneur as an example, and so I'm feeling it extra as an entrepreneur now because now I'm having to do something out of our comfort zone, which was, you go to medical school, you go to law school, you go to business school, all those things that you are guaranteed an outcome, right? The secure fields that you're like, oh yeah, you study, you become a doctor. And now I'm in this very uncomfortable life of entrepreneurship that I struggle with the external validation heavily, right? Because with entrepreneurship, you don't know what's going to happen, what opportunities are going to come your way. Are you going to be quote unquote successful in the way that you were raised in, right? Like the metrics and the grades and well, how much did you get paid? What did they say? I mean, all of that feeds on you and can leave you in isolation and shame. I have a lot of parents who listen to the show, and I think what you're saying really resonates again, not just if you are an Asian American, but again, that if you grew up in that culture of external validation. You said it so beautifully. How have you undone this narrative for yourself? And when did you start to realize that this needed to be undone in your whole journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's constant work. I'll probably spend the rest of my
Mm-hmm.
life, trying to undo it, because it is so deeply ingrained in me. Um, but I also started to reject it at a pretty young age. Um, growing up, I was, in many ways, I did fit the mold. I loved school. I was very good at school. I was a great student. Um, but I was always artistic. I always wanted to be a writer and a painter. I'm an athlete. I ran cross country in high school and college, and those were my passions. Those were the things that I wanted to do more than anything in the world. And in my household, they were supported to a point. They were supported as
Yeah.
hobbies, but then when it got time to get serious, suddenly none of that was okay. I had to go into finance,
Yeah.
or law, essentially. And I did. I went down that path, because it was important to me to try to. I wanted to fit in with my family. I wanted to make my
Yeah.
parents happy. I did that the way so many people do, and so I went down that path. And after college, I graduated. I went straight into a management consulting firm. I was engaged to a doctor. I was living that life to a T.
Yeah.
And I thought, though, that if I did that, if I followed all of these rules, the unspoken part of this is that if you follow these rules, we're going to have stability and happiness, and we're going to be, guarding ourselves from all the sort of problems that, everyone else deals with, and we're immune to these because we have done all the things that are supposed to make us stable and successful and happy. And so that's what I believed at the time. But that's when I started to see that even though I had accomplished these things, I was miserable.
Mm-hmm.
My relationship was not fulfilling at all. I was miserable at work. All of my coworkers were also miserable.
Yeah.
Um, and and in my family, um, I don't want to get into too many of the details here, but basically my family was falling apart. And I thought that, like my brother was so successful. He was in college, he was an intern at SpaceX, Elon Musk's company. And then he actually got a job offer at the end of that summer, and he was one of the few interns to do so. And he turned it down because that was the same summer where he had a psychotic break and he attempted suicide. And what led him down the depression, I mean, the fact that he got so serious down that path was terrifying to me, not just because I almost lost the person that I loved the most, but because as his sister, he felt like he couldn't tell me. And I saw how he used, how everyone around him too used his success as a way to gauge his wellness,
Yeah.
and then how he used it as a way to hide his unwellness. And that shook me to my core. And I started questioning what we were giving up to to achieve this status and these images, and how maybe if my brother had received the message that, yeah, you're brilliant, but you don't have to do all of these things to prove your worth. You can do whatever you want to do, and you don't have to go down this path. If we had sent him that message, he wouldn't have tried, he wouldn't have gone so far down and pushed himself to a point of literally breaking himself. And so that's really when I started to question the impact all of this was having. And I had luckily I'd never quite fit into the mold, so my interest helped me see things from a different perspective. Whereas everyone else in my family was naturally talented at this thing that society really rewards us for, which is your intellect and the way that my brother was just so happened to be born brilliantly, like he was a brilliant engineer, and maybe I think that in a way was a handicap to him because it didn't let him separate the expectations placed upon him from his authentic self and
Yeah.
what he really wanted for himself.
Oh, I absolutely. I'm thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I think anyone who's listening to this that's also in other careers like healthcare, Healthcare is another example. Like you said, everyone's miserable in healthcare right now. And I'm not saying everyone who went into it because of that expectation that that's what they had to do. Some of us really did go into it because we wanted to help. But you're right. We are struggling in these fields that you think that, okay, if I do X, Y, and Z, I will get the accolades, I will get love from, checking those check boxes. I often talk to that with my husband. And thank you for sharing that story about you did all that sort of things that you thought would lead you to that model minority expectation, right? You were engaged to a physician. You were miserable though. Like you did all the things that you thought, but you were miserable. And so when you started to realize this, did you do therapy, writing? Like what helped you actually finally say, you know what, I'm done. I'm getting out of this. I need to redo that. What was that final do? I know you said it's a lifelong process, but where do you think, what do you think really helped you get to that point?
Well, there were a couple of things. One, I will say that it's not like I started questioning the system first. That was the last thing that I questioned. First, I questioned myself. I thought that I had failed somehow because we're taught this message, we're indoctrinated with it at a very young age, and it's not just like you said, Asian American families. It's this whole country. We are, the idea of the American dream is drilled into all of us. And we believe that if we achieve it, suddenly we're going to have it's the solution to everything, and it's not, unfortunately. And so I felt like this sense of failure, that like I had failed to be happy with a life that most people would feel so lucky to have. And so I didn't question things at first. But what happened was essentially, I had tried to do things the way that I knew my family wanted. And things just got so, and I detailed this in the book about how just basically things in my family felt like they had hit rock bottom. And I realized that if I stayed in the life that I was currently in, I was going to go in that same direction. So to me, it felt like an existential, not just an existential threat, but like a real, like almost life and death situation where I didn't know if I was going to survive this. And
Yeah.
so I got to a point where I was like, something in my life has to change. I can't control my brother or my dad or my mom or my partner. I can control my life, and I need to make some serious changes. And I see, like I was waking up like dreading to go into work, like completely numb, disconnected from everything. Just would like, and then I would like sometimes like cry before I had to go into the office. Like I just, every day was a struggle, and I couldn't do it anymore. And I said, there was one thing in life that I knew that made me really happy, that filled me with a sense of purpose, and that was writing. And I've
Mm-hmm.
known that about myself since I was a kid. But what I didn't know anymore was, I'd spent so many years suppressing that desire and that creativity. I didn't even know how to get in touch with that part of myself anymore. But I felt deeply that something in my survival depended on it. So I quit my job and I said, there are people out there in the world right now who get paid to write. And I had enough, you know, like success throughout college, I guess, like to know that I have some ability as a writer.
Yeah.
So it was not like it was still a pipe dream, but it was like a calculated risk of like, okay, I'm going to quit this job. I'm going to give an honest effort and really try to become a writer. And by that, I just mean getting paid to put words on paper. If it's as a copywriter, that's fine. Like that would be amazing. I just want to work with words. And so I quit my job. I didn't really have a plan aside from that. I essentially gave myself 2 years. I said, okay, a lot of people go to graduate school for journalism, and what do they get out of a journalism degree? They get a network, they get some things published, and they can get an internship. So I was living in New York City at the time. I decided that I'm going to live off of my savings for 2 years, the time of a graduate program. And those are going to be my three goals. I'm going to give myself 2 years to accomplish those three things, and if by the end of those 2 years I'm not able to do that, then I will say, okay, you know what? I gave it a fair shot. I don't have any regrets, and then I'll go back to something else. But, the amazing things happened. And a year later, I had an internship at Gawker. And then I was hired from there by another website where I was suddenly a journalist. And so I saw that this gamble on myself had paid off. And that gave me so much confidence to keep going down this path. And what I didn't realize then is what, like, quitting a job, like, to me was not just about a job. It was about this idea of who I am and who I have to be in the
Yes.
world. And once I saw that, once I left the job, I was like, I'm never going back to that version of me. I can't do it. And so I continued to make decisions that were, that were breaking that mold. Like I ended up breaking up with my fiance just 6 months so I got into journalism, and then probably about a year after that, we broke up. And then basically I just, blew up my whole life. And I didn't know what I was walking towards exactly, but I knew what I was walking away from. And I knew that whatever I was walking towards, I could do so in a way that was more alignment with who I am. And I didn't know who that was yet, but I knew I was getting closer and closer to figuring that out.
I love that story. I'm so happy you took a chance on yourself. And it really is, you're doing great work. And like I said, taking the passion that you knew you always had as a child. I'm very similar. I always loved to write, but I always loved to create videos and do skits and act. And I get to do that now. And it feels great. And I'm just so thankful for you and your conversation that we're having today and the book that you have created. What do you hope that you can change for future generations? You know, those of us raised in this culture, but wanting to pivot and change, maybe if you have children or not, but also just change for ourselves. What would be your dream for our listeners today?
Yeah, well, so one of the reasons why I wrote this book and why it felt so urgent to write this book is that what I see now in our country is that we have now several generations of immigrants and children of immigrants, who have grown up on this idea, this myth. And what I'm seeing in the world today is that rather than breaking the cycle, we are passing this down to the next generation and actually adding to the pressures, increasing the pressures. You can see it with the rise of political candidates who are using their identities, like Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley, using their identities to deny civil rights, to take away rights for people. We see it in the way affirmative action was gutted. We see it in, we see it in the UK. We're seeing it everywhere, and
Yeah.
it's becoming, and we also have a mental health epidemic for young Asian Americans in this country. Young Asian American adults are the only ethnic group whose leading cause of death is suicide. Yet our communities are the least likely ethnic communities to seek help for mental health. And so I felt that there was this urgency to share this message and this story. And it's very hard to talk about these issues,
Yeah.
but by using a personal story that people can see themselves in, it's a very non-confrontational way to begin to examine yourself and your life and your decisions and have conversations within your family about intergenerational trauma, about mental health, about estrangement, that most people, um, it's a really hard thing to talk about. But using a book, using somebody else's story and these experiences, I found has given a lot of people language and vocabulary for which to talk about these things and to talk about them in non-judgmental ways that create empathy and connection and are really helping families across the country dismantle some of these ideas and think differently.
Oh, thank you so much. And I love chatting with you. I loved being able to connect about this again, not only from the model minority perspective, but also just the values you're talking about in terms of the external validation, the things that we are doing that I also agree we're passing down, not only politically, like you mentioned, but a lot of us are not undoing it, even if we think we are. I give the example, and I'm going to just use this example. It's probably not the best one, but my generation is so fixated on children doing Kumon. So I know you know what Kumon is. I don't know, but for listeners, Kumon is this sort of academic activity thing to basically hone in on math and science and like academic skills. And from a young age, my generation, my peers are pressuring their children to do Kumon. I'm not saying like, oh, they want to do it. They are literally pressuring them on a Saturday to finish their Kumon, threats if they do not finish their Kumon. And I'm like, we are doing what our parents did to us, that you are putting pressure on academics. I get it that we want our children to have basics in math, science. I'm not saying that that's not important, but we are also causing anxiety from a young age by not allowing our children to play at a young age, putting them pressure on, yo, no, you need to finish this. If you don't finish this, you're not getting your dinner. If you don't finish this, you're not doing this. Threats, yelling. I'm like, is that what we want? Are we trying to create another generation of this model minority that you think that happiness is finishing Kumon, success is finishing Kumon? An example I give just because I see it so much, and I'm like, no, you can have academic success, you can have all of this happen, but you don't have to put this pressure on. And is that what the end goal is? Do we want our children to be stressed and getting A's and all of that, or do we want them to do okay in school, well in school, be supported in school, but also, like you said, have attunement to who they are, what their needs are, their mental health? And I think we do a huge disservice. What I see in my generation, being Indian American right now, and the peers, I'm like, hey, everyone, just stop with the Kumon pressure, please.
Yeah. I think there's one other thing I would add to that, which is part of the message of my book too, which is that when we are when we're pressuring kids in that way, what we are teaching them is actually that our love is conditional. I don't think that we see, parents might see it that way, but what that teaches children is that you get rewarded and you get my affection when you perform.
Yes.
And I pull it away from you when you don't perform in this way that makes me look good. And what we're teaching kids when we do that is that their self-worth comes from their performance. And when those kids become adults, they don't have the ability to understand that they have worth and they matter just for who they are. And then they enter a world in which society, their corporate jobs tell them the same exact thing, that they don't matter unless they can come in and do X, Y, and Z tasks for this, for their boss. Or they don't get a job unless they have X, Y, Z on their resume. And so this message is reinforced.
Yeah.
Really, our family systems are the only place, or the fundamental place, where we can learn unconditional love and what it really means to have that. And without that base, we feel lost.
Yeah.
And we're fearful. And that is really that conditional love is really what causes so much of it's the foundational problem, I believe. Because if you don't believe that you have an inherent sense of self-worth, you're constantly looking at it from other places. And that creates so much trauma and pain in the world. So really, it's not just about like some added stress or even anxiety. To me, it's about like something core about being human.
Yeah.
And being able to, if I had had that ability, and if my parents were robbed of that too, they didn't have that ability either. But this is the product of intergenerational trauma. And when we have that ability to regulate and to know that we matter as people, regardless of what's around us, that's what real liberation looks like. And that's what I think really solves a lot of the trauma in the world. And playfulness, this idea that like play as children is frivolous, or I actually think it's one of the most important things. Obviously, I'm not a parent, but I find as an adult like that everything that we can't create a better world if we can't imagine a better world. And that capacity for imagination that comes so naturally to children is something that as adults we're hardened, and are torn away from. And I'm constantly trying to get back in touch with that sense of playfulness, that sense of imagination that just comes so naturally to kids. So I believe that it's one of the most precious and special things in the world. And I'm constantly trying to cultivate that in my own life. So I think like as a parent, if I were a parent, that's something that I would really want to encourage in my children, and like let them explore, because that's their uniqueness, that's their individuality, and that's going to be like the source of all their gifts to the world as well.
You don't even have to be a parent to know that. And I agree with you completely that we have lost, because of this stress and this pressure. And like you said, this corporate America, American dream, model minority, all of it together, this pressure to perform, we've lost our children's ability to be themselves and play. And I see it so young. And we do a great job of it with our 4-year-old. At the time of this recording, he's 4, but we see our peers not doing the same. And then we start to second guess, and we're like, wait, should we be doing that? And me and my husband have these conversations and heart to hearts, and we're like, no, our son is happy. He's loved. He's in school. He's learning the things he does. But when he has off time, I'm going to let him run outside and climb a tree. I want him to get outside and use his imagination, be bored, be comfortable with being idle. You mentioned this earlier, right? That we grew up not celebrating rest, right? Performance and being busy was just the nature. And a lot of us, whether you are a model minority or not, do that as well, because that's what we were raised in. This sort of rest is for the weak. You don't rest. What do you mean? You're just going to sit around on a Saturday? That's a lazy Saturday. No, that's a Saturday. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to rest. And I agree. Cultivating this sort of play-based childhood, that rest is healthy, goes down to children. And I know we're talking about adults and me and you and our peers, but you are right on that this goes down to how we parent children. And that's why I really wanted you on this show, because I know all of the things that you just mentioned go downstream into childhood. It goes downstream into how are we showing up, and how are we taking all of this baggage and the stuff that doesn't serve us and really make it a better experience for our children, and also better experience for ourselves. It's possible.
Yeah, it is possible. And I think these are the things that actually paradoxically, like, the model minority myth we think will lead us to stability, success, and happiness, but it doesn't. And it's actually these skills that do.
Prachi, thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation. I love, love, love everything that you shared with us. Where can people go to stay connected? And also, where can they go to get your book?
So my book is available hopefully at most bookstores across the country, but also online. You can go to bookshop.org is a website that I like a lot. You can also find it on Amazon. And for following me on social media, probably Instagram is the best place. My Instagram handle is at Prachi, Prachigu.
Thank you so much. I'll be attaching all of this to our show notes as well. Again, her book is called They Called Us Exceptional and Other Lives That Raised Us. I think it'll really resonate with so many of you if this conversation resonated with you. Thank you so much for joining me today, Prachi.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. If you love this conversation, make sure to hit that thumbs up sign, share this episode on your social media channels, and subscribe to this channel to stay up to date on all future episodes and our weekly educational videos. Have questions or comments? Make sure to comment below, and I'll see you all next time. Stay well, stay loved, and keep on shining.